What are you ashamed of? Have you got weird fingers? Do you watch odd stuff on the internet? Maybe you actually bought Labubus. We all experience some degree of shame, but it's interesting to consider where it comes from. Social psychologist Daniel Shinster compares shame to pain. The function of pain is to stop us from hurting ourselves. If you absent-mindedly leave your hand on a stove or in a dog's mouth, pain is the signal that tells you to remove it. And shame is like a pain signal at a social level, warning us not to hurt our relationships. Imagine your distant ancestors, hunting, gathering, trying not to die. Well, not dying was a lot easier if everyone cooperated and got along. But let's say one particular member of their group had a propensity to throw their own feces about, just as an example. That would be pretty unhelpful for everyone involved. So the feeling of shame might be a learned trait to stop behaviours like this, a little voice saying, that's not good. So shame is a survival mechanism. It stops you being ostracised or beaten to death by, in this analogy, the people you threw your poo at. Don't worry about the analogy. And so by this logic, shame is an evolved emotion, one that's been selected for over the course of human history. The people who survived and passed down their genetics were appropriately shameful. Your distant ancestors might have been ashamed of not being a competent hunter or an attractive mate. They didn't want to be devalued in the eyes of their group, and shame kept them on the right track. We can think of shame then as our internal response to the social contract of our society. Of course, if you've ever been on the internet, you might get the sense that this social contract isn't always being fulfilled. Watching people prank the homeless or influencers sell you betting apps, you might wonder what happened to shame and can we bring a bit of it back? But there's also an ugliness to shame. It's shaped by the culture we grow up in and also contains hangovers of our evolutionary past. And so people feel ashamed of things that no one should feel ashamed about, like their sexuality. And studies have shown that shame can lead to prejudice and aggression. It can make us project a critical view of ourselves onto others, like the classic stereotype of latently gay homophobes, hating but also wanting a little bit, which some studies have shown to be a reality. So that's the problem with shame. Your parents and distant ancestors might have left you with a shame that doesn't make any sense for you here today. It's like being ashamed of not being good at throwing spears at woolly mammoths. Don't stress, very unlikely you'll be put in that situation. Understanding where shame comes from is important because it lets us make better judgments about whether or not the shame in question is valid. Ashamed of your height? Don't be. That's an ape concern. Ashamed of how much time you spend on your phone watching AI slop? Yeah, you should have better taste. But of course, we all experience different amounts of shame, and some people are literally hardwired to be shameless. Genghis Khan, Adolf Hitler, the little green man from SpongeBob, what they share is an insatiable desire for power. And what's interesting about powerful people is that they often display a specific psychological trait. It's a term you've probably heard getting thrown around by any American who's ever been upset: narcissist. Narcissism involves a lack of empathy, inflated sense of superiority, and a remarkable shamelessness, traits that shouldn't really be conducive to success when you have to cooperate in a group. But the self-confidence, ambition, and total lack of regard for others we see in narcissists are pretty advantageous to amassing power. And contemporary Western society, for various and potentially economic reasons, seems to reward not-so-great behaviour. Consider, for instance, that psychopaths are massively overrepresented both in prisons and senior corporate roles. Just food for thought. Essentially nastier people then might have somewhat of a leg up in becoming powerful. But what's even more interesting is that there's some evidence this also works the other way around. Power might actually make us narcissistic. An experiment at Melbourne University found that when putting men and women with higher testosterone in positions of power, they began to misuse it, becoming entitled and exploitative, suddenly showing narcissistic traits. Now, the hormonal element here might imply that some of us have a biological imperative to seek power out, but the results showed that just wielding power really can make us a bit more awful, which is worth considering if you venerate people for being rich or influential or your boss. Don't. they're probably despicable. So narcissists seek power, and power creates narcissists. It's a real chicken and egg situation, except instead of producing life, it produces ghoulish tech CEOs with loads of cash and no empathy. Now, this inspires an interesting vision of the world, positions of power across politics, finance, and industry dominated by bad people, a hierarchical system with the worst at the top. Bleak, and also maybe true. So why, you might ask, do people accept a world like this? Why do the unpowerful majority submit to a system of top-down narcissism? Well, there's another psychological concept that has an answer to that: system justification theory. It goes something like this. Humans are intuitively scared, and we're always looking for ways to reduce threats and uncertainty. So many of us are drawn to defend and even encourage the society we live in, no matter what. Because if we tell ourselves that everything is fine the way it is, we don't have to have scary thoughts about what should change. This is why, in the vaguely kinky words of the theory's author, John Jost, we submit enthusiastically to the humiliations of the powerful. And what's really crazy is that, according to this theory, the most disadvantaged people in a system can be even more likely to encourage that system. Even if we're consciously aware of unfairness, the soothing effect of defending the status quo can be more appealing than getting a bit 1780s France about it. Jost claims that this theory could explain why conservatives and rightists, who are often more likely to defend the status quo, report feeling happier and more satisfied than liberals and leftists, regardless of wealth and income. So this strange and unconscious bias might explain why so many of us are ultimately happy for the powerful to get their way. We are, in effect, scared little animals. So much of our psychology ultimately comes back to fear. Fear of death, fear of change, fear of your mother's legs. Freud, I think, wrote something about that. Now, some of our fears are innate: heights, loud noises, and things that might have bothered our ancestors, like snakes and spiders. We know to be frightened of these things before we've actually experienced them. Other fears are learned. You learn to be scared of speaking in public, fantastical monsters, or being stripped naked and having an accident while speaking in public. And what you learn to fear is also cultural. Studies have shown that East Asian people fear isolation more than Westerners. Japanese people have an understandably pervasive fear of nuclear weapons. The most common fear for Americans as of 2025 was corrupt government officials, presumably across both political aisles. But what's fascinating about fear is that it doesn't really work as intended when we've learned to fear too much. Fear evolved to protect us from danger. It's essentially our amygdala saying, run away, just like disgust evolved to protect our immune system, in this case our amygdala saying, please don't eat that. But our fear reflex evolved to protect us from immediate danger, a leopard or another human with a big stick. You have more speculative and nebulous things to worry about: gas bills, work deadlines, being bullied on X/Twitter by an AI robot, not to mention apocalyptic visions of nuclear war or climate collapse, or some repulsive combination of the two. We're now exposed to an entire buffet of nasty threats. And according to evolutionary psychiatry, our brains just haven't caught up. We still fear these things like they're right in front of us, waving a stick about. And so we experience this sort of ludicrous omnidirectional fear, which might explain our skyrocketing rates of anxiety. Now, the knowledge of this isn't going to make those fears just go away overnight. But the next time you do feel scared or ashamed or impotent in the face of power, just remember, you are working from the very weird and complex brain of essentially an ape. So take what it tells you to feel with a pinch of salt.